All right, why don't we get started? Always gives a chance for a few more people to come in and all that. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Professor John Ford. I'm with the Institute of Corporate Responsibility at GW. It's my pleasure to have Lindsay Singleton here to be our guest talking about ESG. I think as most of you know, the topic of ESG just continues to surge and is a bit hegemonic, if I might say, starting to take over other phrases and other terms. I think after a while, people get tired of too many terms and initials, and they just want one thing. And it wouldn't be surprising if people just settled on ESG as that one thing, for better or for worse. So the purpose of this series is just to get to understand the ideas better, see how it's being used. It's great to have Lindsay with us, and she's going to talk how she addresses ESG issues. Lindsay's managing director for ROKK, and her role, I really like the description of her role. It's growth of the firm in developing new and existing client relationships through engaging and out-of-box communication strategies. That sounds like a lot of fun. I like that job. So also, it's very nice to know that Lindsay is a GW graduate twice, once in 2005 with her bachelor's and once in 2008 with her master's. So thank you, Lindsay, for joining us.
Thanks, John. It's great to be back with the GW crew. It's been a minute, but I'm looking forward to a really fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just underscore for those listening, that is part of the idea of the series, right? To chat a little bit and to see if we can, push a little bit deeper into some of the practicalities and from your point of view, what ESG means to people, how it's being used, what its importance is, and all that. For those of you that are participating, if you have a question, we agreed to just put it in the chat, and then I'll track those. And as we're going along, would you prefer, Lindsay, when we're doing this, to kind of wait and give a time so we can chat about some of the questions we discussed? Or if people want to jump in and ask questions, can we just kind of see how it goes? What's your preference?
Yeah, I'm fine with whatever works easiest for you, because I know you're sort of managing those. So,
well, good. All right. Thanks for being flexible. I appreciate that. Well, so why don't we start? Why don't you tell us a little bit about ROKK, right, and what your firm does, obviously, in particularly to make sure we understand how you're addressing ESG.
Sure, thank you. So ROKK Solutions is a bipartisan public affairs firm based here in Washington, D.C. And what we really do is provide communication strategies and solutions, and we execute on those for clients. A lot of the time, we sometimes say that our clients are either trying to get Congress to act on something or get them to get out of the way if they have a problem or an issue. And so we don't lobby. So there is a distinction there, but on the public affairs side, we really work on the communication. So what are the messages to help really tell the story and get the point of view of our clients across? And our clients range from, big household brand names that you've all heard of, to nonprofits, to trade associations, and even sometimes individuals. That's a lot of fun. Every day it's a kind of a different challenge, and we work on a range of different issues, from transportation to healthcare to apparel, and that range really grows on a daily basis. And then the service offering that I launched later last year, our social impact communications practice. This practice is really about taking those good news stories from companies and what they're doing on the ESG side and helping to translate those in a way that resonates with public officials and stakeholders on both sides of the aisle. Because one of the things that we found is that building those relationships and helping to create that halo effect around your organization can really help when you're trying to approach a public policy challenge that you need assistance on. So making those friends, in essence, before you need them.
Yeah, that's great. Well, as you and I have chatted about, the discussion around ESG just continues to grow, and you find it popping up everywhere. But also we know that there's a lot of disagreement amongst people of how they see it, even what it means, what are the implications, right? It's a very active dialogue, sometimes a contested dialogue. Just from your standpoint and the way you look at it, could you just kind of summarize maybe how you define ESG, but maybe also how do you describe it to your clients?
Yeah, So, look, a lot of people, there are a lot of different terms that are out there, and you alluded to this in your intro. We hear a lot about sustainability, and that's a really useful term. It's a catch-all. And I think it's something that is, I don't want to say that it's going out of fashion, because it is still an important concept, but it is sort of a catch-all for all of the doing good that an organization can do. It does sort of have that environmental connotation, but it's a little broader than that. ESG, though, has a little bit more of a distinct focus on three pillars. I think originally, and you probably know this better than I do, I think it was originally more used for capital markets and the investment side. But it's really increasingly the preferred term for corporate efforts that not only reduce liability and risk, so those elements that you might look at in financial markets, but more broadly to do good. And the three buckets that they really look at are environmental, social, and governance. And, of those, the environment and the governance issues are sometimes a little bit easier to understand. There's still a little bit of flexibility on the social. It can be a little bit broader and harder to sort of nail down exactly what that means. And part of that, I think, is because the environment around ESG and what it means to be a socially responsible organization or business is changing so rapidly. And I'll just highlight a couple of other terms that are used too to sort of differentiate. A lot of companies still utilize CSR, corporate social responsibility, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a great term. One of the challenges, though, that I see, especially with some of the clients that I engage with regularly, is the use of this term as a substitute for corporate giving. It's not the same thing. And corporate giving is, a lot of businesses begin their ESG journey with corporate giving. I sort of see it as the gateway drug for social impact. And especially for startups or companies on the smaller side, it's a really great place to start. No matter the size of the company or the kind of approach it takes, from my perspective, whatever the company's approach is to ESG or sustainability or CSR, whatever you want to call it, there's a way to translate their approach into a story that'll really resonate with a key audience, whether that audience is here in DC or at a local level of the communities that they serve, nationally, internationally. There's a story that can be told.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to get to the storytelling because I think that's a key part of one of the things I wanted to learn about your approach. But maybe we could just stay with those terms again. You mentioned CSR, there's corporate philanthropy, there's sustainability. Do you see those terms, and maybe I guess what I'm thinking is, kind of each of those terms has their own kind of stakeholders or their own interested parties in having those terms used, right? Particularly say in sustainability, the groups have been working for decades trying to fashion the policies they want and using that language. Do you see those kind of diluting, being blended in, it all becoming one thing? Or do you see, just say over the next 5 years, or let's say 4 years for this administration, they'll all have currency and people just have to understand we use them for different reasons and different things?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think a lot of it has to do with who is using the term. Look, as I think practitioners might want to be much more specific in the language that they use when they talk about ESG or corporate philanthropy. To be honest, at the end of the day, I think if an organization is committed to social impact, personally, I don't really care what the terminology is. I mean, I think the terms might be more useful for the people who are kind of in the nitty gritty every day. But, from where my audiences stand, whether, Capitol Hill or in the administration, I don't necessarily think that there's a preferred term for these audiences. What they care about is the impact. What are businesses actually doing to help the communities that we're all trying to lift up? What are they doing for society?
Yeah, that's a really good answer. It occurred to me while you were talking, right? There's also corporate citizenship. And so, right, there's all these terms. So I really take your point that maybe from the user side or from the analyst side, maybe it doesn't matter that much how thinly you slice the issue and use one or the other. As you said, it's what are you doing underneath it? And it sounds like you're saying, at least in your world, people aren't going to worry that much whether you're using the correct term in their mind. they'll get past that. So we can continue to use those terms. It's really not a negative in any way. At least that's what I think I hear you saying.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, great. Well, again, before we get to storytelling, I saw in the news last week that BlackRock, right, big equity for those listening know, big equity investment firm, biggest equity investment firm, and BlackRock has been a voice in the ESG space, especially their CEO writing letters and kind of a call to action. And this has been going on for a few years. He's been, timing them to Davos. I mean, it's been a very active kind of communication campaign, right? And I think some people just wonder, like, what's behind it? Is this an investment strategy? Is this a social conscious? Is this what's going on? But the reason I bring it up is last week, maybe you saw, he added very explicitly that now BlackRock was going to be looking very carefully at human rights, right? They'd really been kind of working climate change space of the ESG. And I think people understood that. Now with the new administration, there's a lot of interest again in trying to do climate change issues and all that. And so now the social. I just want to get your initial reaction of, like, that was a big wow moment, like that opens up a whole new market, or like people are going to be confused. Just what was your own reaction in terms of, like, kind of what that meant?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I always look out for Larry Fink's letters. I think that they really help to sort of, they're a bellwether, right, for where ESG is going. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was really fascinating that the focus just last week is he's focusing more on human rights. And the reason I think it's so fascinating is because human rights is going to be a very dogged challenge for so many companies. One of the challenges that I think a lot of businesses face, especially if they're selling products, is the issue of supply chains. And in the U.S., it's one thing to have a voice on human rights, and that can mean something very specific domestically. But if you open that conversation up internationally, the global supply chain and the global picture on human rights is a very different story. And it's going to be a really pernicious challenge for companies, especially those who have vested interests and vested supply chains and investment in China, considering what's happening with the Uyghur population and the human rights abuses there that are so pervasive right now. Companies invest in their supply chains for the long term. And so to be able to extricate themselves and move manufacturing or production to another part of the globe that has better standards, that's a really hard thing to do. And I think that, look, I'm not an expert on ESG investments, but I wouldn't be surprised if the indices that are focused on ESG aren't going to be looking really deeply at some of these supply chains and some of the exposures that companies have there. So I think the fact that Larry Fink focused on this last week is going to really kind of open the floodgates at how we're looking at companies' global commitments to human rights.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. Of course, human rights has been around for such a long time. I'm old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter started making it, the flagship because of some of our past policies. But it has become very kind of institutionalized through the International Labor Organization. So if you're a corporation, it's like, well, what are we supposed to do? Okay, right, let's go look what those people say. But it does feel like that when it comes from someone like BlackRock, it's shaking things up. Like, you're just not going to be able to say, oh, no, we're great in human rights. It's like, oh, what do you mean by human, right? So it sounds like it'll cause tumbling and all that. Yep. And the only point I'll make about it for those listening, maybe new to ESG, I think it's a great example of how this investment side and this corporate responsibility side come together. Right, Lindsay, as you mentioned, terrible human rights experiences, right, in Western China with the Uyghurs and all that. So you might say, oh, that comes from the heart, right? We don't want to be investing in those things that cause that kind of human suffering. But at the same time, if you're investing, just to what you said, and you're investing in firms that are deeply embedded in those supply chains, your company's value is really at risk. And as an investor, you're going to want to hear some stories about how you're dealing with that risk.
Right.
So I just think it's a really good example how those two really kind of overlap and blend together. Yeah. Well, great. Well, let's talk a little bit about this idea of your storytelling, right? I always, when we had started, I thought that was a really interesting idea. Can you just explain, just a little bit what you mean by that and how you address it, to address ESG issues for those you're dealing with?
Yeah, thanks. Look, there's a lot of data out there, right? But when we talk about storytelling, we want to help people connect to the data. It's one thing to talk about, numbers of customers served, but it's a whole lot different when you try to make a number more than a number. How did that widget that you gave them, how did it impact them? So we have to show impact, and that means accessing the stories of communities and their individual members. It's a qualitative measure, which makes it sometimes hard to describe with just numbers. One of the things that, it's always a struggle, especially in PR and communications, is, we don't want to confuse output for outcomes. And the difference here, outputs are, how much money we invested or how many hours were volunteered. These are really easy to measure. But impact, the outcomes, that's so much harder to get at. And so because we don't necessarily have numbers always to help us really describe that, we turn to storytelling to show impact. So for example, we want to show the impact of a women's empowerment program. The number of women that we helped is great, but what I really want to do is go deeper and showcase maybe one woman or one community so that my audience understands how they were helped. Where are these women now because of the program? What more do they have? How have their households changed? This is what we use to humanize the data, which is really, at the end of the day, what I mean when I talk about ESG storytelling. And our goal with clients is to use these stories to build policymaker recognition of their social impact and help them develop relationships with key stakeholders. And this sort of goes back to my earlier point of, making friends before you need them. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to, maybe throw up on the screen an example here of one of those. So if you give me a second,
Perfect.
I will put up here a case study of something that we did for my client, the International Franchise Association. So if you look here, so IFA, they represent the franchise businesses. And this client was really eager to broaden its image and tell the story of diversity and inclusion as it relates to economic opportunity. So we worked with IFA to identify a pair of sisters, Michelle and Donna Lewis. They're two Black female franchise owners in Detroit, and they run an event space called Painting with a Twist. And what we did was help to tell the story of how they came to own this business and the impact that it had on downtown Detroit. This was an area that had been really economically devastated before entrepreneurs like the Lewis sisters began investing in their community. So to help tell their story and create a broader discussion around the needs of the business owners, we convened an event at their space and invited local leaders and elected officials. One in particular, Representative Dan Kildee of Flint, participated, and this was a really rich discussion that ultimately helped tell IFA's story about how franchise opportunities in minority communities really can help build up these communities and provide economic opportunities for folks who don't always have those opportunities. And ultimately really helped IFA build relationships with Democratic officials in a way that we hadn't been able to before, because we've been so focused previously on what it was they needed from a policy standpoint, and not really getting out there some of these good news stories. So this is an example that I wanted to share with you guys because it's one of my favorite clients, and they have so many stories like this that we really enjoy sharing on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When you do the storytelling, say going back to the specific event, do you have in your own mind maybe the sense of what the stories are that certain kind of officials, public officials, elected officials have, and then you try to target, like if we could tell that story, we think it would resonate with that person, or isn't it so specific and targeted? It's a little broader.
Yeah, look, it depends. It really depends, I think, on the objectives of the work. So, in this case, we were really trying to help IFA build relationships with Democrats. A lot of their policy standpoints where it comes to wages and labor make a lot of sense for the business community, but they also tend to resonate more on the Republican side of the aisle. So to try to not only, look, we want to ultimately show folks on both sides of the aisle that their policy preferences and priorities make sense for America writ large, that they aren't necessarily partisan. But we were trying to, especially, I think, resonate across the aisle with Democrats and build some relationships there where maybe they weren't as strong before. And so in this case, looking at a district that is traditionally Democratic, working with partners that had stories to tell that really resonated with some of the Democratic goals on the D side of the aisle, that was part of the objective there. But it depends. There are some clients who are trying to reach a very, very specific elected official who maybe is a very powerful chairman of a committee. Or maybe it's, with the COVID relief work that so many people are involved with right now, maybe it has to do with reaching, Jeff Zients over at the White House. So it depends, but it can be broad. It can also be very targeted.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, probably better than I do, right? That some people, when they hear these stories, maybe they're a little cynical and they think that it kind of glosses over, right, kind of what the reality is. I just, like I say, I remember that maybe in kind of a certain day, at least amongst some officials, if there was a policy debate, you might have someone go do the study. It might be a think tank. They had a high reputation. They ran the numbers and they would say, look, the numbers are the numbers, right? I mean, they say, the tax cut that was done had this effect and right, and all that. And by the power of that analysis, then people would have to kind of say, well, I can't really speak against, the numbers. But I wonder if you feel like maybe the storytelling is a easier or better way to do it, just in terms of how you feel like engaging people. Do you actually think the storytelling ends up being better than trying to crunch numbers for them? And what I'm trying to separate it out is that maybe it's easier because it is a storytelling and they can remember that. Maybe they don't have to work as hard, if I could put it that way. But what do you feel about like kind of those two different approaches?
Yeah, look, I appreciate storytelling because I do think that it is what often sticks with you. But I will say that I think that the approach that I see a lot of success with is a marriage of data and storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it's important to crunch the numbers because I think people do depend to some extent on that statistical proof of the concept. But to make that data come to life, it's really important to paint a picture for folks. And I think that's true no matter where you are, if you're on Capitol Hill or if you're in Akron, Ohio or Lenore, North Carolina. People love and really can relate to stories. And I do think that the storytelling can help make some issues that maybe aren't as, that are maybe seen in a more partisan way, resonate differently and make them more accessible to people to, kind of help both sides of the aisle come together. Because you and I have talked about this too. There's such a, it feels like there's such a partisan divide right now. And sometimes these stories can help bring folks together. One example that I think is really meaningful here is, looking at climate, right? Climate is something that I think for a long time, folks have really assumed is an issue that only Democrats care about, Republicans don't. And I don't think that it's helpful to look at it that way. but I also think that it's not always helpful to approach the climate debate from a perspective of what we have to give up to make things better. What if we tell stories about company impacts on farming communities that are at risk of losing their livelihoods due to a warming planet? That story might very well resonate with someone who has been left behind by the traditional climate discussion. So maybe instead of presenting what we need to give up, we present more of a climate positive future that really welcomes all stakeholders to the table.
That's really interesting. And I guess if I'm hearing you right, the storytelling not only makes it, a little more graphic and easy to remember, but maybe it pushes through the initial information that people got. Like maybe climate change isn't real, or it's exaggerated, or I don't know, right? Whatever people might hear. I'm not trying to judge climate change, but what I thought I heard you say and wanted to see if I'm right, that story can kind of make them think a little bit more about it, maybe dwell on it a little bit, and use that as a way of figuring out how they feel, maybe rather than just a first impression. And you would think the data probably isn't very good at doing that, right? Moving people off their first position, but a story might.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that, in the PR and communications world is, if we're writing an op-ed and we're trying to highlight a specific data set, and we're talking maybe about a problem that's costing American taxpayers $14 billion a year. Okay, you can say that, but is there a way to maybe make that number come to life? Like, I'm just making this up, but $14 billion is, that's equivalent to the annual GDP of X, small nation or something like that, that helps people kind of put it in context. And so I do think that sort of the combination between the data and the story that brings it to life can be really, really important. And it does set I think our clients apart from those who are just crunching numbers and just presenting a statistical data set.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And if I might add, and those who are just telling stories, because that's the story that wants to be told, right?
Sure.
Sounds like you're finding that middle ground. Well, because it's Washington, D.C., right? And we're always thinking inside the Beltway. Are there some topics now that you would see are being discussed or are more popular because of kind of this movement towards ESG and people talking about it that maybe hadn't been before? Or another way of thinking was just like, what are some of the hot topics in ESG that you're hearing about, through your clients?
Yeah, I mean, when we do marry here at ROKK, we are looking at both sort of the partisan and political lens, as well as the social impact stories. And I think with what's happening in Washington right now, there are a few things that I would point out. First, you mentioned Larry Fink's focus on human rights, and I would imagine that will become a bigger issue here in Washington as the Biden administration moves on. But I do think that diversity and inclusion is a very, very hot topic. I mean, we have our first female vice president. We are experiencing an uptick in anti-Asian racism. There's a lot that's happening, I think, in our society that will ultimately percolate up to, the Washington political classes and what they're going to care about. What I do find interesting, and something that, I hope you and I will work on more together, is this sort of, what are the issues that really bring folks together and resonate on both sides of the aisle? There's not really a ton of research yet on what specific issues will really resonate with both political parties and their voters. I think that this research is still very nascent, but there are, I think, a few issues that help unite. I think veterans issues seem to poll very well across the board. But I do think that diversity and inclusion might end up being one of these that can help bring folks together. But, as we learn more about which issues resonate with whom, we can't really wait to act. Companies can't wait to act and kind of live their purpose and execute on their values. A lack of perfect information is really not an excuse for inaction. So we have to apply, I think, communications frameworks to ESG stories that really help bring everyone to the table to the best of our abilities. So, this sort of goes back to identifying the message components of a particular program that will resonate with different communities. And I mentioned climate before, and kind of figuring out what's the angle there that will resonate with everyone.
Do you have some specific kind of, I know you kind of mentioned one, kind of like the farming and all that. Do you have any others where you think about how do we bring the climate change story to people who otherwise either like it's a bit remote, for them, or they've been told through certain channels and authorities that it's really not a big deal? You had mentioned the one about the farming. Are there other kind of stories that you find or your clients go like, yeah, that's a good story to go tell about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, most companies have emissions targets, and I think that those numbers are really, really important. But I do think that how do we frame that in a way that makes sense and is approachable to average consumers, average voters, and there are certain parts of the country that are more impacted by climate change right now than others. And so maybe I'll take, for example, Louisiana, that has a lot of challenges with floodings due to hurricanes, and the communities there that are impacted by that. So how can we maybe take the numbers that companies are crunching around their emissions and humanize that in a way that maybe weaves it together into the story of a community that is going to face increased challenges due to climate, in a way that maybe paints a better future for that community. And this is tricky. It's not an easy thing necessarily to develop a story frame around, because you can't necessarily connect the dots between a specific hurricane or a specific storm to climate change. But look, we know that these sorts of weather events are going to become more commonplace due to a warming climate. And so helping to connect the dots between the statistics and the data around emissions and those reductions that are going to help communities with what's actually happening on the ground in the communities that are hurting, I think is a really powerful way to get the point across.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering in that because I spend a lot of time trying to think through, how do corporations select and then execute a decision that they think represents, what they want to do, what they think their stakeholders want them to do, and to message it in a clear way. And I think, as you and I said, I just think that's incredibly hard to do. And things are moving so quickly, right, all the time. I wonder if you might just say, how do you think that, social media, right, in general, all of the Twitter and all of that stuff that people are becoming used to normal, how does that affect maybe your ability to try to tell those stories? Is it an enabler? And does it make it easier to get to those people? Or is it, right, does it kind of undermine what you're trying to do because of it?
Oh no, gosh, John, I love social media. I mean, I have a love-hate relationship with social media because of, I think, some of the difficulties that we saw around the elections. But when it comes to telling stories, I do think it's a really powerful platform. It allows us to reach so many more people with stories and what companies are doing to create social value. And you mentioned, we talked a little bit about data and sort of the marriage between data and storytelling. And I love it when I've got a really juicy statistic from a client that then we can design something around, or maybe tell a story with a video, or some interesting piece of content that's going to catch a consumer's eye, and then help tell the story of what client X or client Y is doing to support them in some way. I think it's really great, and there's so many ways now that you can sort of make sure that, people in Kansas are seeing the stories that we think will resonate with them, or North Carolina, or you can really slice and dice your target audience, and it's a great way to engage with them, and get some feedback on what's working. Is that story actually resonating? We thought that it would, but do we need to tweak it a little bit, or how do we up the engagement? And we've got a ton of comments from constituents now. Is it time to maybe show this story and the engagement that it got and the support that we're getting for it to their representative in Washington? And there are ways to do that. So it's an incredibly powerful tool, and it really, I think, helps complete the suite of tactics and strategic components that we're able to apply for our clients.
Yeah, well, that's great. It's really interesting to hear. Just wanted to stick, maybe again, try to pursue a little bit the ESG and the challenges it faces. Oh, Lindsay, your video, or at least on my screen, went away.
I'm good. I just have to plug in my computer.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe that's better. We didn't see it. We'll wait for you.
No, please, if you want to go ahead, I just got to pop around.
Okay, all right, no problem. Well, what I was going to say was, and follow up a little bit on something you mentioned earlier, which is the S in ESG seems to be the one which is kind of the most curious, or the one which we seem to have the least, hand on. And that a lot of the issues and the topics around the environment, people are pretty familiar with, I would say, in that space. They may not agree, but sometimes we say, like, we know where the gutters are on both sides of the issue, and we know what we're trying to do. And I would argue in corporate governance, same thing, right? It's not that I'm arguing that people who say what is good corporate governance are right or accurate. It's just the way we talk about it, the terms we use, what we refer to is pretty well settled. And it's that S part where I think, just in terms of the discussion, I was looking the other day and kind of wondering, particularly with the Biden administration and being pretty active. I think you and I agree, right? Talking, they're pretty active and are going to be active in the ESG space. That's going to be part of their discussion. And one of them is in the environment, of course, but one of them is in infrastructure. And since we have a big bill coming up, that's the story. So I was just thinking of an example, and I thought, well, how might you either do a storytelling, or what would you suggest? I mean, I'm kind of making this up, right? So it's a little hypothetical, but let's just say Duke Energy, right? Biggest energy company down in North Carolina, and biggest domestic, energy company. And they have a number of what they call coal ash pits, in which they keep, the ash, right? That comes off when they burn the coal, and they got to put it somewhere. And these are always a worry for people because they might leak and cause problems and all that. And if one of them breaks, as just happens for every once in a while, I mean, it's a real catastrophe, right? In terms of having that go in. Okay. So again, just thinking of ESG and the S part, when you look a lot of times where environmental sites have been and where they've been placed they've placed them in communities of color or people who are Black predominantly. Yeah. And so, it's pretty hard to say, looking at just the numbers, that that's in fact what Duke or anyone else, right? I'm not trying to make them the bad person. I mean, utilities do this stuff, and was just trying to make it particular, that they did place those ash pits in communities that were Black and not white. That's what they did. But of course, what's also true about that is that the land in the places where they located is also cheaper. So from an economic standpoint, you could see, if that started to get more attention, right, kind of energy equity issues, this is part of your ESG responsibility. I was just kind of curious about how you might think or have kind of talked through for people listening, like, okay, that was the past. Some of those things happen. How do we talk about it going forward, but recognizing the costs to the firm, like, are substantial? And so just from both the business side, the social side, how might they talk about it? I don't mean to put you on the spot because you and I didn't practice this before, but I just think if you might kind of say, well, these are the things, right, that you might want to start to think about. I wouldn't do this. I might just some of that. And I was trying to buy you a little time to think about it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
Go ahead.
I mean, look, I have a client right now that is very engaged in these issues. Environmental justice, I think, is going to be an incredibly important issue going forward in ESG, and I think that does fall pretty neatly into the S. And look, every company is different, and I'm not necessarily in the business of telling them what their social impact program to combat and or to help increase environmental justice should be. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for companies in the energy sector to get involved and make investments that help ensure that these communities where they have facilities that could be damaging, to make sure that these communities have either the protections that they need or their investments in areas where they should be sending their kids to school, whatever it is. There are activities that are happening right now, and it is a really important thing for these organizations to be thinking about. Yeah, and there will be big expenditures there. They will be costly. Ultimately, though, I don't think it's about how much you spend. I mean, this is a very thorny issue. Similar to just transition, right? And as you take down and dismantle coal facilities, what are the people who are working there and depending on those jobs? What are they going to do? I do think this one is maybe a little, I don't want to say it's easy, because it's certainly not, but retraining and upskilling is certainly easier than trying to move communities to safer places. But these are, they're thorny issues. They're going to they're sticky. They're going to be with us for many, many years. And companies have a responsibility to put into action plans that help, mitigate some of the problems that either they themselves have contributed to, and some maybe, certainly not maliciously or with any intent, or even just the issues that are important to their consumers and their audiences. The important thing, I think, is as a communicator, is that the programs that companies put in place, the kinds of investments that they make in ESG, are on brand and authentic to who they are, that they make sense for what that company or organization does, for profit. It should make sense what they're doing not for profit and the investments that they're making.
Yeah. Do you think, just again, in this case, does it help in terms of kind of messaging? I mean, again, if you just use any utility who is in this situation, right? I mean, one argument could be, okay, you're right, because you can't say that the facts are not the facts, right? So you have to acknowledge. But to try to point out to people that, at least in the sense of, well, when we did it, when we were making these decisions all these years ago, right? Some cases decades ago, like, we were told it was okay. Now you're kind of moving the goalposts up. So you know what I mean? Like, does it help a company to try to say, or should it just be like, you know what? We now see, right? I got it. Let's move forward. And trying to explain that past, just how would you kind of handle that?
Yeah, it's difficult because you want to. I think our inclination, our instinct as humans is always to justify the decision. And in this case, it's very easy to vilify a company that has facilities that are environmentally damaging in underserved communities. But you're exactly right. Like, when they built these, no one lived there. The land was cheap, and it created a lot of opportunities for builders to come in and prop up communities where it was cheaper. There's no right or wrong answer here, but I do think that in communications, if you're explaining, you're losing. So I do think that for the most part, it's best to instead of talk about the problem, talk about the solution, and frame the stories in a way that are showing what you as an organization are doing to solve some of these difficult challenges.
Yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I was going to add, in some of those places, though, there were people there, but they were just politically marginalized. So they had no voice, right, to say anything about it. And I think your point about trying to focus on the solution kind of underscores what we've seen with CSR, and I think we're seeing with ESG, is that it's a moving target. And if a company feels like they can kind of pause, take an assessment, make their decisions, and then say, we're good, like, you're kind of missing the point. You're going to have to be constantly updating and all that. Do you agree with that regarding ESG?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very quickly moving environment, and as we talked a little bit before about the Larry Fink letter and sort of how that's going to redirect some of the focus on, at least on the investment side, but probably much broader. It's a really quickly moving target, and companies are going to be updating their approach, their targets, their strategy. And it follows that the communications around those strategies and the impacts that they're having will follow suit. I do think that it's important to sort of start as you intend to go. And I think if companies are making smart strategic decisions about where they want to focus their efforts in a long-term way, there's ways to tactically maneuver and change course if need be. But I think that most companies try to take this long-term view of where the direction they should be heading and the kinds of impacts that they want to make.
That's great. That's perfect answer to introduce this question that comes in from Janelle. And she says, Lindsay, how do you ensure your clients aren't greenwashing when you tell those ESG stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it is something that I think about a lot when I'm engaging with folks on the client side, because look, I'm very passionate about ESG, and I want to make sure that the stories that we're telling are real ones. One of the cool things, though, about storytelling and really talking about specific impacts as opposed to just the numbers is that we're able to often, through our clients, talk to the people who were impacted. And so we're able to really, pull out stories that they're true. I'm talking to Michelle and Donna Lewis about how, a franchising economic opportunity changed not only their lives, but their community. And so these are the kinds of stories that I'm looking for when I engage with my clients. And I want as much as possible to engage with them, if I can directly. But even if it's through, through the company or the trade association, and I'm able to, there's some email back and forth, but at the end of the day, there is some contact directly or indirectly with the people who are impacted, with those communities. And those are the folks that we're able to lift up and tell their stories. So, look, there's no perfect answer, but I really believe no one wants to be the bad guy. Everyone is the protagonist of their own story. And I think that there's an extension that goes to ESG, and companies truly, I think, are trying to create social value because they believe it's important. It can be great for the bottom line. It can be great for their image, but I really do, I am an eternal optimist, and I really do believe that companies are doing it because they believe in it. And, just as sort of a very personal anecdote about ROKK Solutions and the kind of people that we're hiring, and everyone that comes through these doors talks about how passionate they are about social impact, and they want to be involved in this kind of work. And I find it really, really hard to believe that other companies are out there aren't hearing the same sorts of things from the people that they're hiring. And so there is sort of there's a push-pull to getting socially involved and creating value in the societies and communities that people serve. And so I really do believe that there's a very pure-hearted motive to getting involved in the ESG world.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks for that answer. That's nice to hear. And I guess it's just one of the reasons, for your company is because people trust you, that when you're moving information to them or in the storytelling, that it is legitimate, it is backed up, it's defensible rather than just fabricating something because that's what sounds good in the moment.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe with the few minutes we have left here, you and I have kind of joked about sustainability reports, right, which have become kind of the standard messaging from corporations, and how maybe they'll just take sustainability reports and just X out the word sustainability and scratch in ESG and they're done. But more thoughtfully, where do you see both that reporting method, because we did talk about messaging and social media, like making the booklet, and then also what do you think about the continuing of making the booklet, and what do you think about how firms might start addressing those ESG issues as opposed to sustainability in the past, and maybe what's different? What do you see coming?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that I don't think that we're close to it, but I do see that we seem to be reaching a point where there's a demand for reporting and transparency. There will probably be, SEC and more regulations that kind of force companies into, reporting mechanisms that maybe they weren't involved in before. One of the challenges around reporting, though, is there's so many different kinds of frameworks. There's no kind of universal standard for it. You've got GRI, you've got SASB, and they're all a little bit different. And I do think that there's a desire at some level for there to be kind of more of a standardized approach. I think from like the receiving information standpoint. From the pulling together information standpoint, from the company stance, there's sometimes it's a little bit confusing, which framework do I use and how do I determine what is material? And it's a very kind of at the company level, kind of a personal decision, what is the best framework for delivering and compiling information? And ultimately, on the question of materiality, you, the company, you have to decide what is material for your organization. No one else is going to come in and tell you that. So there's sometimes an uncomfortable amount of space to operate in where it might be easier if someone just told you what to do. But at the end of the day, I don't think that companies necessarily want to be told exactly what framework or how they should be telling their stories. But look, I do think, I think it's a little bit sad how sustainability reports have so often been relegated to obscure links on websites, because they are a rich trove of information and data. And, a lot of times I think companies have been really great at incorporating storytelling into those sustainability reports, little call out boxes with quotes or very specific examples of communities that were impacted. But what I would love to see beyond just those reports staying on a website forever and never really going anywhere else is for companies to realize that these are missed opportunities. If they're not taking the information from their reporting and all this information that they have compiled and poured blood, sweat, and tears into, and telling those stories to an outward, a more external audience, whether it's policymakers or the communities that they're serving, there's so much wonderful data and stories to mine to really communicate and resonate with audiences across the board.
That's great. Well, look, we're up to our time. It's been a great discussion. I can't thank you enough, right? I mean, everyone who's at least in this space all talks about, how big ESG is and how it's growing and how important it is, but it's really not so clear, like what it kind of adds up to. So part of this series, and I really appreciate you giving your perspective, is to try to find, certain perspectives, people like you who are working up to your elbows in it, maybe higher, and, just to share, what it is that you do and how you do it and how you frame it. I have one last question here too. Okay, I don't think we asked that question. So good. So I think we're all done for the day. Lindsay, thanks a million for coming. Thanks for everyone who's listening. I'm sure if people have any questions, they can follow up with me or follow up with Lindsay. And thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you, Lindsay, for spending the hour with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been great.
Okay, good. A lot of fun.
All right, take care. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.